But I think we have to be concerned about that because I don't think we're really as caring and neighborly and understanding as we were, a couple of decades ago.
Well, you and I went through the Depression period
Yeah.
where there was, I think, a much closer common bond of people.
Yeah.
We were all in the same boat. But what do you do about it, Doug? We agree on the problem.
Well, I, again, reluctant to say this, but I don't know if hopefully you could correct it by education. That would be the way to do it. And you'd have to start in schools, and you'd have to worry about the curriculum. There's a big argument in Michigan about curriculum. But you'd have to, I think, teach kids a sense of fairness, a sense of caring for each other and compassion. Absent that, maybe the turn won't come until we have another economic decline. I mean, a serious economic decline. Now, that's a hell of a way to get educated, but you and I went through the worst in the history of this country. But, I share your view. I remember those days well, Tom. I was, 13, 14, 15 during those years. Lived in a neighborhood where everybody was laid off, all auto workers, including my father. And yet there was this neighborliness and togetherness, and maybe it's because everybody was in the same boat.
I hope we don't have to pay that price to get it.
I would hope that that is, as you know, I think that was a very important part of our education.
It was. And I think we still have depression scars. Maybe they're good, maybe they're bad. Now, a couple other things to jump on that Lanny Guinier has written about how there should be shared power. That her example is that kids are playing, 4 want to play tag and 5 want to play hide and seek, so they take turns, which sounds reasonable, but you went through the factional days of the UAW. Would it have been possible to sense there was shared power that each group within the UAW had a certain number of seats on the board, but did they fight like cats and dogs, or am I being too cynical?
No, I think that kind of factionalism, I think the membership suffered during that period because everybody concentrated on the politics and not on the people, not on the programs and principles. I think those kind of politics are destructive. I think the best you can get, if it isn't a bitter fight, the best you can get is absolute gridlock. And I don't think that's the way democracy should work. I think the majority has to rule. One of my big arguments is Rule 22 in the United States Senate, the filibuster rule, where a majority can't work their will. And we lost the striker replacement issue and campaign reform issue just to the last Congress. We've lost over. Now, we, of course, are using it against Republicans. But despite that, it's unfair. It's undemocratic.
I think the Senate has that apportionment problem that Nevada has 2 senators, Michigan and New York do. Certainly the Supreme Court's done a lot on legislative for the state legislature's apportionment. What about this?
Well, I think, that if I might inject, Tom, I think Gus Scholl and perhaps Ted Sachs deserve a great deal of credit in the old reapportionment fight, because they, more than any other individuals, took that fight to the Supreme Court and got some sense out of it. Because I can remember well reading the decision. I remember Justice Frankfurter say, well, we shouldn't get involved in that. It's a thicket.
Yeah.
And thank God the Supreme Court did get involved. At least we've got some equity on the House of Representatives side. We don't have it on the Senate side because that's built into our Constitution. But I think that was one of the most important political fights that the labor movement ever advanced.
And I think Ted Sachs gets a lot of the legal credit. I think the one that really deserves the credit is Gus Scholl. I said was a high school dropout.
Yeah.
And I remember meeting, in fact, there's a little history on that Menon Williams had won big, and the Senate ended up killing everything. It was I think 2-1 Republican, and the committees were about 4-1 Republican. They'd pick the dumbest Democrat to be on the key committee, which was kind of hard to find at times. And Gus had me count up the number of people that voted Democrat and Republican. And even though the Republicans had the Senate 2-1, more people voted for a Democrat senator than a Republican.
Well, Gus used to have, I remember well, a tree stump speech.
Yeah.
He used to vote tree stumps rather
Yeah.
than people.
And he had that sense that many legal scholars didn't, that somehow or other, if it got to the U.S. Supreme Court, it would not say that a tree stump equaled a person.
Yeah. That's
And
right.
I think Gus gets a
Well,
lot.
that's a great fight. It's very
And
important.
Ted Sachs gives a lot for the legal end, a lot of the credit. But I think Gus was
Now,
the
Gus
real
is
driver.
a mover. I mean, Ted wouldn't have been able to argue it unless Gus had,
Right.
had formulated the position.
Now, I think Walter was more, if I differentiate Walter and Gus, and I'm going to talk to Eric Bluestone about this, I'd say Walter was global, and
Yeah.
Gus was worker Michigan Union.
Yeah.
Would you want to comment on that, the relation of the two?
Well, Walter Reuther, I don't know if you could compare Gus or anyone else. Walter Reuther was a very unusual man, Tom. He was, I never use this word recklessly. I rarely use it, but I think he's close to being genius.
Yeah.
He was interested in the whole world, and he used to talk about, you can't make progress at the expense of the community. You can only make progress with the community. And the community to him was not the community in which we lived only, but the community of the country, the community of the world.
Yeah.
And he had this global view, and that's why it's interesting to think what his position would be now, but he was an absolute free trader.
Yeah.
He thought it was our responsibility to help the underprivileged and poor nations of the world lift themselves up. But each in their own way served the Union well.
Yeah.
And both were great leaders in their own
They
way.
came out of the same place, but I think
right.
you're right that Walter had more of a global.
Yeah.
Now, one of the I remember this, that he wanted to use the interest on the strike fund to organize internationally. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
And that was one of the few things he wasn't able to get through the convention. Am I right on that? Or
Yeah, well, we
tried to?
eventually did. I'm glad to say it was during
Yeah.
my watch that we, in 1980, we took half of the interest from the strike fund and to spend on 3 functions: organizing, communication, and education.
Yeah.
And of course, interest, because our strike fund is so huge, it generates a hell of a lot of revenue. And so it's a very meaningful change we made in 1980. And, but people sort of get, revisionist history. Waller didn't always get his own way with the board.
Yeah.
And that was particularly true when it came to some incumbents who Waller thought shouldn't be incumbents. The board sort of rallies around each other, But he was he's a man of tremendous principle, and of course he had this great gift of articulation, and he could bring people along.
When I think his greatness, he got good contracts, he got good grievance procedure, and he acted internationally.
Now,
And that combination.
You make a very, very important point, because he used to say, we had a regional director who was involved in anti-Vietnam movement. Nobody quarreled with that, but he spent nearly all of his time demonstrating with the Hollywood stars. And Walter says, he says, I agree with your position, but the first thing you have to do is take care of the members' needs. And then they'll allow you to do these things. For example, when we marched with Martin Luther King in the South, now I'm sure our white membership could have strung us up, except for they thought, well, negotiate good contracts. We'll allow for this deviant conduct.
Yeah.
And so they allow you to do things and take unpopular positions because you said it, because you deliver on the collective bargaining.
I think there's a regional director, I think, from California that just let grievances pile up. And the membership, your first job is to take care of the grievances and the good